I don't know if you've experienced this working from home, but you never know how much of a gremlin you are until you start fully working from home.
No, totally.
Um,
The one thing I miss the most is I am a shoe girly. I have like so many beautiful high heels and they just like sit in my closet.
same. It's the worst.
I have like no opportunity to
Um,
wear them
okay,
anywhere.
well, we can do a GD politics special that's just Mary's heels.
You are
And
not putting my feet on the internet. Galen Druk.
Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen. I've lived through a lot of news-packed weeks over the past decade of podcasting, and I'm sure many of you have probably lived through them with me. And even by those standards, the back half of June has been a doozy. Remember when the LA immigration raids and protests were leading the news? Yeah, that was only 2 weeks ago. Since then, we've had a military parade, nationwide protests, Israel went to war with Iran, the US bombed Iran's nuclear facilities, there was a record-breaking heat wave, a socialist won the New York City mayoral primary, the Supreme Court ruled to severely limit nationwide injunctions, amongst other things, the US stock market hit an all-time record, and, of course, we're not done yet. President Trump is hoping to get the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed by July 4th. So today, we're going to talk about some of that news and how Americans are reacting to it. We're also going to check out a new analysis of special elections since Trump took office. Yes, Democrats are overperforming, but not to the same degree everywhere. Here with me to tackle all of this are two of the industry's best data journalism hands. Mary Radcliffe, welcome to the podcast.
I don't know if I would call myself best, but thank you, Galen.
Take the flattery. It's a Friday. Also here with us is Lenny Bronner, data scientist at The Washington Post. Welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
It's so great to have you. So, as I mentioned, it is a Friday. To pull back the curtain here, we're recording this episode a little bit early. And in fact, we were about to kick things off talking about public opinion on the Iran strikes, but then the Supreme Court dropped its final decisions of the term. So we're going to briefly begin there, acknowledging that this is not a Supreme Court podcast and we are not judicial scholars, but we do know something about what Americans think about these things. So the big case of the day is that the court ruled to significantly limit, but not totally do away with, nationwide injunctions that lower federal courts have the power to impose. So, for instance, whenever the president puts out an order and it's immediately paused, that's what's going on. It's something that presidents from both parties have railed against. This means that injunctions could now be piecemeal across the country, or to get a nationwide injunction, the complaints may have to be class action lawsuits or brought by states themselves. Alternatively, plaintiffs could try to take their cases straight to the Supreme Court. The case at hand was about Trump attempting to end birthright citizenship, which had a nationwide injunction against it. This new ruling is on pause for 30 days, during which time new cases are likely to be filed, and frankly, by the time you're listening to this, have probably already been filed. The majority opinion did not touch the merits of ending birthright citizenship. So one of these things is very processy, and the other thing is quite clear cut, or at least probably easy to understand for Americans. But I'm going to ask first, do we know how Americans feel about nationwide injunctions? Because people are making a big deal of this. The president himself, held a press briefing to talk specifically about this. But are Americans tuned in, Lenny?
I mean, I don't know if they know specifically about federal injunctions, but there has been a discourse, for a while now about the relative power that the different branches of government have. And generally speaking, most Americans don't believe that the courts have too much power. They generally believe that it's the president who has too much power. So a recent poll from the AP that was released in May, so this year, quite recently, said that half of Americans think that the president has too much power versus only 30% believe that the federal courts have too much power. Similarly, 30% believe that Congress have too much power. That being said, that's not quite true amongst Republicans. Republicans do see that slightly differently. In that case, they think half of Republicans think that the federal courts have too much power, while only 20% believe that the president has too much power.
Lenny, when was that survey done again?
This was May.
Wonder the extent to which that would flip if we had
Right
a survey
now.
when a Democrat was president.
Oh.
That when your own party holds the presidency, you might say, oh, the courts who can mess with my president's executive orders hold too much power. And when your party's out of power, I wonder if there's a flip-flop there.
I would totally believe that. I wasn't able to find a similar one from earlier, though I'm sure they exist.
Yeah.
But I was and you're right, when we cut this down or look at this through like Democrat versus Republican or independent or whatnot, that's probably true. But I was sort of interested in what the top level numbers there were too.
Yeah, for sure.
Also, we have seen time and time again that the Supreme Court is pretty political in terms of how it releases its decisions. Like, they always get the press coverage of what a bipartisan, term the court is having, how interestingly they've divided along different ideological lines. Look at Amy Coney Barrett. She's quite the maverick on the court. Which, I mean, I think that's probably still the case if you look at the data in totality of this Supreme Court term. Amy Coney Barrett has surprised people at plenty of turns, but they save some of their most sort of partisan, ideologically divided decisions for, it's always a Friday in June. And then all of a sudden, all of the coverage of like, oh, look how congenial and bipartisan the court has been this term sort of fades to nothing. And you get some of these dissents and responses that we saw today that were just like, basically like the justices slinging mud at each other. I don't know, maybe this is strategic in the sense that nobody is paying attention right now. And so Americans are also not going to be paying attention that much to how the law surrounding nationwide injunctions have changed. But I also wonder if after more high profile decisions come down, people change their mind. Like in the aftermath of Roe, or Roe being overturned, would Americans have said that the Supreme Court has too much power? Versus right now, people are thinking that, mainly about Trump in May.
One thing I do want to flag here real quick is that the survey actually separated between the federal courts and the Supreme Court having too much power.
Oh.
So amongst Republicans, 25% of Republicans think the Supreme Court have too much power, but half of them think that the federal courts have too much power. And versus for Republicans, the other way around, where 17% of Democrats, think that the federal courts have too much power, but 33% of Democrats think the Supreme Court has too much power, which I thought, is an interesting dichotomy yeah.
So you're telling me that Americans don't have strong philosophies about the separation of powers. They just want their party to win?
Shocking.
Wanted to say one little thing about the partisanship of the Supreme Court, because our friend Cooper Burton pointed out to me that there's this big poll that's done every year by researchers at Harvard University and Stanford University and the University of Texas. It's called SCOTUS poll. And what they do in that poll is they sort of like outline a lot of the big cases that are before the court in that session in sort of easy to understand language and ask what voters think about those issues. And this year, in every case SCOTUS poll asked about, the court's ruling aligned with public opinion. Every single case. Now, I should
including these most recent cases.
Well, we have to carve out birthright citizenship because the SCOTUS poll did not ask a question about limiting nationwide injunctions. They asked a question about birthright citizenship. So technically, that question maybe doesn't match what the court actually decided on. But it is true, even in this poll, and it's true broadly in the polling landscape in general, that a pretty significant majority of Americans say that birthright citizenship should stand. So in the SCOTUS poll, it was 64% said that birthright citizenship should stand. But we don't have public opinion about the nationwide injunction sub-issue specifically. So I just flagging, in terms of interpretation of the court as partisan, like maybe they're not quite as partisan as we think.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. As in, like, the Supreme Court is not as partisan as partisans would like to believe. But I mean to say maybe that they're more political in the sense that they save their potentially unpopular opinions or most divisive opinions for last. So they don't get negative coverage all throughout like May and June. They just save for a Friday in June when nobody is paying attention. Because, I mean, yes, like I think throughout time we've said the Supreme Court is dividing in interesting ideological ways. The majority of Supreme Court decisions are still unanimous or do not fall along the 6-3 split or whatnot. But it does seem that there's this strategy of waiting for a Friday in June.
Though I don't know if this strategy is that good. I feel like if you dropped your most contentious decisions early, yes, maybe the discourse would be the entire time about, the political nature of these decisions, but also those decisions, they'd be coming, more and more decisions would be dropping, and so the news coverage would have to move on, versus now we're probably going to have a lot of stories about these decisions for a while.
I think there's another side to that coin, though, where if you hold your controversial stuff until the end of the term, you don't spend the entire term suffering criticism for doing all that controversial stuff, which might frame the news coverage in a way where if you came out with some opinion that was actually quite reasonable, people would interpret it as partisan or political or what have you, even when it isn't. And so they're saving that criticism till after the other serious stuff of the term has already been absorbed.
Yeah, Mary, to that end, I'm curious if you could actually just run through some of the places where the court's decisions aligned with public opinion for folks